On May 6, 1880, deep in the hills of Little Chute, Wisconsin, James and Rebecca Donington were going about their business one evening when they heard something that shook them to their core. What was found the following day was both mysterious and disturbing. Up the road from them lived the Verwer and Heiberg families. They'd immigrated together from the Netherlands to Little Chute a few years before. Both families mysteriously disappeared from their cabins that night, leaving the town and those around them in shock and fear. James kept a journal of what transpired the night both families vanished, and his encounterings with the families spanning several years before. Some of the text has been modernized. These are his journal entries. April 2nd, 1877. It appears we have some new neighbors. Rebecca and I were tending to the garden when we saw them go by in their wagons. We waved at them and said hello, but they did not wave back or say anything. They simply looked at us as they went by. Rebecca commented on how unfriendly it was of them. It looks as if there are two different families with multiple children. September 28, 1877. The families have been building cabins up the road from us, within shouting distance, I'd say. I've wanted to go introduce myself but haven't, being it's against Rebecca's wishes. She's always saying how she gets a dark feeling about them. One strange thing did occur today in the evening before dark. I was walking from the cabin to the barn when out of the corner of my eye, I saw something white. I immediately stopped, looked to my right, and was surprised to see a young girl in a white dress standing in the trees, staring at me. I looked at her, smiled, and said, "How are you, young lady?" She did not reply. She continued staring at me for a few minutes, slowly turned around and walked back towards the direction I'm assuming she came from. I shrugged my shoulders and continued walking to the barn to feed Tilly. At first, I thought nothing of it, but as I was feeding Tilly, I started to get an uneasy feeling and thought how strange the girl seemed. I debated whether or not to tell Rebecca about the encounter, as I knew I'd never hear the end of it. I ultimately decided to tell her, and she was none too pleased. I told her even though the family seemed strange, there was nothing we could do about it. June 17th, 1878. It was evening, I'd say about 6. Rebecca and I were returning back home from being in town all day, visiting with friends and getting supplies. As our cabin came into sight, nothing appeared out of the ordinary at first, but as we got closer, we could see children standing in the trees behind our cabin. I counted 6 of them, but Rebecca said she counted 8. Rebecca grabbed hold of my arm. She was trembling as she asked me, "James, what is going on?" "I'm not sure," I replied, trying to sound brave, even though I was as scared as she was. As we pulled the wagon up to the barn, the children immediately turned around and slowly walked back into the woods, heading towards their cabins, I assumed. October 30th, 1878. I was sitting by the fire tonight smoking my pipe when Rebecca, who was in our bedroom, let out such a scream I'd never heard before. My pipe hit the floor as I ran to the bedroom to see what she was going on about. I asked her, "What happened? What's all the commotion about?" I was getting our bed ready when I looked over at the window, and there was a child standing there, staring at me from outside, she replied. She then grabbed me, hugging me tightly, then started quietly crying. She was trembling something awful. "I'll go talk to the families and tell them to keep their children away from our cabin," I said. "No, leave it alone, James. I don't want you going over there. Do you hear me?" she replied. March 29th, 1879. Rebecca is away visiting her family in Green Bay and has been for the last week, so I've been tending to the garden and animals by myself. I've been wanting to go introduce myself to the families up the road. It's something that has been bothering me for quite some time. I made the decision when I woke up today to do just that. After breakfast, I mustered up the courage and walked up the road to their cabins. As their cabins came into view, I could see there was no one outside, which meant I'd have to knock on their doors. I almost turned around at the thought of that, but pressed on. I noticed their cabins were built fairly close together, within 15 feet perhaps. This seemed odd to me, but again, everything about these families was odd, I thought to myself. As I got closer, the front door to the cabin on the left slowly started to open, and out came a man. I immediately froze in place, put up my hand and said, "Hello, sir. How are you?" He said nothing, looked at me for a bit, then walked and stood in between the cabins, acting like he wanted me to go no further. It was then I noticed something behind him. It was something sticking up out of the ground, about 4 feet high, and was covered with a blanket. The man had long dark hair and a long beard. He didn't seem well kept at all. We stood there looking at each other for a while before he finally spoke in a thick Dutch accent, saying, "What do you want?" "I'm your neighbor down the road. Just wanted to come introduce myself. I'm James Donington and my wife is Rebecca," I said. I stood there waiting for him to reply and introduce himself, but he said nothing. As I stood there, I thought to myself, how long should I stand here waiting? I finally spoke up and said, "Well, nice to meet you," turned around and quickly walked back home. I must say, that was the strangest encounter I've ever had with anyone. I wish now I would have listened to Rebecca. Going there did no good. It made me more uneasy about them living so close. I plan on never telling Rebecca about this. May 6th, 1880. Right before dusk, as I was putting my horse Tilly into the barn, having just returned home from town, I heard a loud shriek in the distance. The shriek was so horrible it stopped me dead in my tracks. I stood there for several long minutes without moving, only clutching Tilly's bridle in my hand. Then I started to hear shriek after shriek. This went on for several more minutes, then everything abruptly stopped. There was nothing but eerie silence. It was so silent, in fact, I could hear my own heart trying to jump out of my chest. I dropped Tilly's bridle and ran into the cabin to tell Rebecca what I'd just heard. She said she'd heard it as well, and it made her drop the apple pie she'd been holding. I could see it in a mess on the floor. We talked briefly about going to check on the families, but we both knew better than to venture up there. Something wasn't quite right with them. We've known it for years. We decided it was best to stay inside with the doors locked and shotgun in hand. We'd go into town tomorrow to let Sheriff Brady know what we'd heard. May 7th, 1880. Early this morning, we went into town to tell Sheriff Brady what we'd heard last night. He quickly rounded up several deputies, a few other local men, and we rode up to our neighbors' cabins. When they came into sight, we stopped the horses a safe distance away, wanting to get a good look around before getting any closer. As we looked around, we could see nothing appeared out of the ordinary, other than the fact the doors to both cabins were wide open. We proceeded to shout for them to come out, but we got no reply. We got off our horses, with guns drawn, and walked slowly towards the cabins. The first cabin we went into was dark and had a horrible smell to it. It smelled like a rotting animal carcass. We checked all of the bedrooms and closets and found nothing. Before walking over to the second cabin, I told them about the thing in between the cabins that was covered by a blanket. The sheriff instructed one of his deputies to go remove the blanket. The deputy walked over, pulled the blanket off, and what we saw was something none of us had ever seen before or will probably see again. There stood a black, shiny pillar with 8 sides to it. It glistened as the sun hit it, and it looked to be hard and made out of some type of stone. We then went into the second cabin, and it smelled worse than the first one. After we'd checked the first 2 rooms upstairs, we heard a faint noise coming from the closet in one of the back bedrooms. We carefully walked through the bedroom with guns raised as we slowly opened the closet door. What we found left us dumbfounded. Inside were 2 small girls who looked almost like identical twins, except one had to be 8 years of age and the other looked to be around 5. They were very dirty and were covered from head to toe in blood. Not 1 inch of their little bodies was without blood. They were shaking uncontrollably, and their eyes were rolled back in their heads. Sheriff Brady knelt down in front of the girls and asked them what happened and where their families were. They just stood there with strange, horrified looks on their faces, not saying a word. He asked them several more times, but they didn't respond. They were, however, mumbling something ever so faintly, over and over again, in what seemed to be a language I'd never heard before. That was the scariest moment of my life. I left that cabin that day a different man than I went in, and I was never the same. The girls were taken into town that day, where they lived with a local family for several months. The rumor is a relative showed up one day out of nowhere, took them, and was never seen again. Before they left town, they were questioned by several different people, but they never uttered a word to anyone. It was said, though, they could be heard late at night, whispering to one another in strange tongues. When the sheriff and his deputies were searching the cabins, one of them happened to pick up a piece of paper that had Dutch writing on it. It was taken to town where someone translated what was written on it. The translation to English read, "We've finally been able to open the door to darkness. This is what we've been working towards for many years. This is what got us persecuted back home and the reason we fled to America. Everyone now will see." For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.